I think quite a lot of your success comes down to workflow, comes down to thinking about what you're doing and how you can produce a good quality product, a good quality show. But what I'm really saying is don't make life more complicated for yourself than you absolutely have to. And actually, if it's much less hard work, then you can afford to do it for much longer.
Hello and welcome to People in Podcasting, a show about the people who make podcasts happen at every stage of their journey. Each week, we speak to someone in the field of podcasting or digital content, going beyond their CV to see how their experiences shaped who they are today and where they're heading next. Podcasting is a fresh, evolving industry, full of incredible people from all walks of life. It's a world where if you've got the skills, you can make it happen. No degree or decades of experience required. It's exciting, democratic, and inclusive. And that's what we're here to celebrate, people in podcasting. And each week, we'll be bringing in a guest to hear their stories, get their advice, and maybe offer a little of our own. Joining us today is...
Hello, my name is Sam Datta. I am an executive producer at Lower Street. I've been in podcasting for about 6 years now, and in broadcasting for close to 20. And that's me.
And I'm Daria Lawson. I'm a junior producer here at Lower Street, and I have a background in journalism and radio.
And occasionally throughout the episode, you'll be hearing from me, Adam Bender. I'm the COO at Lower Street and have a background in finding talent in the industry, inside and out. I'll occasionally pop up to offer reflections on what's discussed and look at how it all ties back to podcasting professionally.
On this week's episode, we're sitting down with James Cridland. James has had an incredible career, starting in radio and later moving into digital media, which naturally led him to become a key figure in the podcast industry. You might know him as the editor behind Podnews, the daily newsletter that's become a must-read for anyone in the podcast industry. Today, we're talking to James about how he's managed to stay on the cutting edge of audio's evolution, from shaping the conversation around podcasting news to where the future of audio is headed. It's a fascinating journey, so let's dive right in.
So, James, you've obviously got a background in radio, in tech. Why podcasting now, and why do you love it?
Well, I've always been interested in audio and always been interested in what audio can actually do. And obviously, radio is a big part of anybody's life, certainly of my age growing up. Audio was a fantastic thing. But then I realized that really things are changing in terms of audio, and we're listening to less and less live radio and more on-demand content, i.e. podcasts. And so I thought, well, this kind of area is really interesting, particularly for where the future's going. So I ended up actually doing a podcast back in 2005, very early in 2005, for a radio station in the UK, Virgin Radio. I think we did the first daily podcast from a radio station back in those days. So that was great fun to end up doing. And I've sort of been involved ever since, really.
I've just always wanted to know, on the really early podcasts, Stephen Merchant, Ricky Gervais were always back in the day, and those really early examples. What was the reception like to podcasting then? Because it obviously wasn't a known medium. It would have attracted a fairly niche, and I don't want to say nerdy audience, but the kind of people who could find audio in an RSS feed, you'd think would be slightly limited. What was the attraction then?
Yes, it was pretty limited until, of course, Steve Jobs put podcasts into iTunes. And of course, when he did that in the middle of 2005, then things changed, and things changed an awful lot. So that was a very good thing. But yeah, I think you're right. I think quite a lot of people look back at Serial and say that was the first big show that anybody had actually heard. I think for those of us in the UK, it was actually the Ricky Gervais show. And that was, for a long, long time, a world record holder in the amount of downloads that particular show was getting. And of course, the BBC doing an awful lot early on in open podcasting and that sort of area. So I think it was a really interesting and exciting time of just people understanding that you could do other things other than what you've heard on the radio. And I think Stephen Merchant and Ricky Gervais's show, I think that actually had a bit of swearing, a bit of heffing and jeffing in it. And I think this was a big, exciting thing for those of us who had never heard that on the radio, of course.
And just on that note of you really being at the nexus of audio going digital, Were you always someone that was interested in keeping on top of new emerging technologies?
Yeah, I was very lucky. So working at Virgin Radio, one of the things that I had to do was to get a story into the press every quarter showing how clever Virgin Radio was. That was basically my brief, was get something in the press showing how clever we are. Because we were a AM radio station at the time, people thought that it was a bit old-fashioned. And so actually for us to be able to push that we were playing around with new technology all the time, that was really helpful. So that was super useful from my point of view, because I was able to not just talk about what we were doing in terms of podcasting, but also I launched the first mobile phone streaming app in the world for a radio station, which was great fun to do. I think we were the first radio station to be available on the Nintendo Wii, as if that's a thing.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. So there were a bunch of these sort of very exciting things, but I think I was very lucky that I was basically left to get on with it. To make the company money, yes, absolutely, but to show that the company was doing new and exciting and innovative things.
Why the Wii?
Yeah.
Of all the platforms and all the consoles in all the world, what was special about the Nintendo Wii that you're like, yes, this is the future of streaming?
Well, two things were the future. One of the things was that was selling really, really well. And also, secondly, it came with Flash built in. And that made streaming live radio really, really easy. So therefore, it was just a very easy press release to actually get out. I do remember, to my eternal shame, I did actually get in a press release out that Virgin Radio was the Pope's favorite radio station, because we had 2 listeners, I think, from the Vatican City, according to the web stats. So therefore, I was able to get that out there. I'm not necessarily sure whether that was entirely the right thing, but the Pope didn't actually say no. So
silence speaks volumes.
Yeah, exactly.
When we talk about innovation in podcasting, it's easy to get caught up in the big, flashy ideas that transform the industry. And sure, James nailed that when he helped take audio digital. But sometimes the most impactful moves are the ones that fly under the radar. Take, for example, bringing radio to the Nintendo Wii. Who would have thought? That wasn't just about tech. It was about seeing opportunities where others didn't, and knowing when to break the rules for the sake of progress. That's the kind of thinking that keeps businesses ahead of the curve. Staying ahead isn't just about riding the latest trends. It's about strategically positioning yourself to capitalize on new opportunities and not being afraid to step outside the norms. In podcasting, new platforms and technologies are emerging at breakneck speed. And as someone who's always looking at the bigger picture, I can tell you, we're just getting started. The opportunities are endless if you're willing to think creatively and take calculated risks. That's where the real growth happens.
So you mentioned this radio app, which we should emphasize was the first of its kind. And I'm curious, during that time, what was the attitude towards taking audio digital? Because radio is still such a legacy medium. So I wondered if there was any kind of pushback.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Virgin Radio was very lucky. We were the first radio station in the world to stream online. And so it was just a different way of getting the audio out there. And the programming team understood that this was going to be a way that they could attract new audiences. And I think we did some research that showed, like a really large number, something like 30% of everybody that was listening to the radio station first heard us online. And I think as a marketing tool, it's a really useful marketing tool. So it comes back to, sound being a very useful thing, of course, anyway, and to use new technologies, to use streaming, to have a very fully featured website as we had at the time that, ended up winning a ton of awards. I think that was a really good way of reaching new audiences that otherwise wouldn't know about us. And I think it's interesting when you look at podcasting now, when you look at branded podcasts, for example, again, that exact same thing is actually happening. People are finding new brands, people are finding new content that they were otherwise unaware of, and finding it through the power of audio.
Definitely.
What do you think your secret sauce is, James, to staying ahead and being a pioneer in the audio space? Because Any radio station theoretically could have created the first radio streaming app in Europe, but it wasn't. It was you and Virgin Radio. And you've stayed ahead of the curve ever since, and you're still ahead of the curve. How do you do that?
That's an interesting question. I think I'm always just very interested in what new technology can offer. And I think, one of the things that I was just very keen in doing is to be involved in this industry in any way that I could. So I ended up doing, I think the 3 subjects that I took when I was 18 was music, physics, and politics, which is not a usual mix of A-levels. But in this particular case, music for the music side of radio, physics for the electronics, and the politics for some of the journalism. But I think just sort of playing around with new technologies, seeing where those can actually lead us is very helpful. So I think, if you skip forward to what I'm doing today, writing a newsletter every single day, but actually I have written all of the computer code that sends it out, that publishes it on the web, and quite a lot of the writing comes from a period when I was writing radio commercials. So I think it's interesting looking at where my career has gone, and actually still very much involved with radio, involved with writing things, and also involved with computers and technology and that sort of side.
Well, obviously, you mentioned your newsletter. And since you've spent most of your time before that in radio and podcasting, how exactly did you decide on the newsletter format? What was it that drew you into that?
So I moved to Australia 8 or 9 years ago, and I think one of the things that I was keen to do was to do a job which works in this silly time zone that I'm currently in. But also it was something that I realized, I've been writing a newsletter on the future of radio for a long, long time. And I realized that was probably something that I could do for the podcast world. So actually I was at a radio conference in LA. I was chatting to a friend of mine in the pub after the radio conference. And he turned to me and he said, "James, where'd you get your podcast news from?" And I said, "Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't really get any podcast news because there's no one really, apart from Nick Quah, who was doing a very good job, there's no one really doing news about podcasting." And so I was sort of thinking about that on my 14-hour flight home and thinking, I wonder if there's an opportunity there. I wonder if there's something that I should be doing. And so that's really why I ended up moving into writing a podcast newsletter and really focusing on the format that it has. How can I produce something which is good and which people will hopefully value? And so that's really why I ended up getting into it there.
Fantastic. Is there a natural complementary crossover between newsletter and podcast and audio? And the reason I ask is because a load of people struggle to get their audience from written content into podcasting and vice versa. Actually, it's very difficult because it lives on very different platforms.
Yeah. And also you write differently for it. So most of the time, if you're going to write an article, that's not going to be done in spoken word. It's going to be done in a way that you would normally write an article in written language. And there is a difference. And I think, again, having a background of writing radio commercials, where you are writing for the spoken word is actually quite useful. The reason why I produce a podcast version of my newsletter is just purely a workflow thing. I needed to read out my newsletter before I press the send button to make sure that it makes sense. And so therefore I was reading it out anyway. And then I thought to myself, why don't I just record myself reading it out? That's basically how that came about. But I think it's interesting. I understand that a number of people who read the newsletter also get the podcast version. They listen to the podcast version when they're in the shower in the morning or when they're getting ready to go to work, so that when they get to work, they know the stories that they were interested in and the stories that they're then going to find out more information about. And so I think that that's a really interesting way of how we operate as human beings. Some people really like the spoken word. Some people really like reading things and skimming things through.
This ties back to our earlier talk about innovation, but let's look at it through a different lens, one that's all about strategic audience engagement. In my role, for example, I'm constantly thinking about how to connect with our audience in ways that drive real value. Take James's decision to launch a daily newsletter for podcasters. He wasn't just throwing ideas at the wall. He identified a clear gap and filled it with exactly what his audience needed. In podcasting, your audience is everything. So from a business perspective, don't just chase trends. Focus on where your audience is and how you can meet them there with something that genuinely matters. That's how you build lasting connections and long-term success.
I'd love to know, James, what is the biggest story that you've broken in the newsletter? What is the story that has had the most impact on you?
Because I've got a technical background, I was very lucky in spotting something only 3 or 4 months after I'd started. Podtrac had just launched a new chart, and it was a short form podcast chart because for some reason they saw a future in 2-minute long podcasts, and they thought that this was going to be a thing. And there was this really weird podcast from iHeart that was doing amazing numbers, absolutely amazing numbers. And no one who I spoke to could work out why this podcast was doing this amazing numbers because A, it wasn't very good, but also B, it wasn't promoted in a sensible way. It didn't have artwork, I don't think. And I realized that iHeart owns thousands of radio stations, and on every single radio station website, there was an embedded player for this podcast, and the embedded player was automatically loading all of the audio. So essentially, when you visited the Z100 website in New York, it was already downloading that podcast. So no wonder it was doing fantastic numbers. Loads of people were downloading it, except nobody was actually playing it. So I found this out, and I had to work on how to explain it in a non-technical fashion, talking about preloading and everything else. And that ended up going up on the website. And I think that was the first story that really got the Podnews newsletter noticed. It was a properly reported piece that was actually calling out iHeart in this particular case for doing something that wasn't necessarily telling the truth. And I think that was a really useful story to have stumbled on 2 or 3 months after I started.
I'm glad you mentioned promotions, because something else that I really wanted to ask about was when you were getting into podcasting as it's developing. It's this brand new industry. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what the advertising and sales sectors were like in the early days.
Yeah, I mean, the press release that Virgin Radio sent out was hilarious in that it said that the podcasts contained podvertising. You're welcome to that word if you ever want to reheat it and use it again. But yes, so I think the first advertiser that we had in the podcasts was Orange, the mobile phone network. But yes, I mean, advertising was very, very nascent. I think that the clever thing that the radio station was doing is that it realized that online advertising, which podcasting was, which websites were, came from a different budget than radio advertising. And so if they could go to a brand and get them to market themselves with Virgin Radio, then that meant dipping into 2 of their budgets, not just 1. And so that actually meant that we were able to grab much more of the money than maybe some of our competitors were. And I think that was a very clever plan. But I do remember going June of 2005, going to, I think it was the first podcast conference in London. I turn up as a person from a radio station. There were lots of independent podcasters there, lots of people who were very excited about podcasting and what podcasting could actually offer. And they were furious that I was there. Absolutely furious. And I was doing this keynote on what Virgin Radio was doing in terms of podcasting and blah, blah, blah. And, I was just having questions like, what the hell are you doing in podcasting? This is our space. You don't understand it. Leave us alone, and all this kind of stuff. How dare you put advertising into podcasts? All of that stuff. So that was a really interesting time. And I think there's still a little bit of that.
I was going to say...
much less than there used to be. And I think actually now radio companies understand much more what they should be doing in the podcasting world. And so I think quite a lot of that has gone away, but there's still a bit of animosity in between the old-fashioned world of radio and the new, upstarts of the podcasting world. And here we are 20 years on.
I was going to say, it still exists to a degree, doesn't it? There's a weird... snobbishness, I think is probably the right word, and inverse snobbishness still between radio heads and pure podcasters, amateur or professional. And you still get a sense of it sometimes. I think you're right. Now there is increasingly an understanding that actually a bigger community with various levels of professionalism and larger radio networks being a part of it actually boosts it for everyone. But there's still definitely a little bit of, oh, well, they're podcasters and, oh, well, they don't understand radio.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of that. And I think, particularly if you look at the French market, the French podcast market, they have, a specific word, podcasts, native podcasts, which is a podcast that hasn't been broadcast on the radio first. You can really see those markets where podcasting is developed and has its own ecosystem. When you have a look at the top 10, and it's not dominated by reheated radio shows, as I call them. France even has different rankers for native podcasts than it does for radio podcasts. It's a little bit weird in that regard. But you look at, for example, podcasting in Southeast Asia, and you can see the podcast charts in places like Singapore and in Korea. Half of the top 10 are reheated radio shows. And so you can see that, that those particular markets are just a little bit slower to get going. So, yeah, it's interesting seeing the differences in different markets across the world.
Do you think that podcasting has changed radio, James, as someone who is and has been deeply involved in both worlds?
I think it's certainly changed how we think about audio. When I started in radio, and I was a radio presenter for a number of years, when I started in the radio, I would have to book time in the studios. I would have to turn up, in the evening to use one of the particular studios because it was a good studio and I knew that nobody else would be using it, to do some pre-production and that sort of thing. Now, of course, anyone can produce great quality audio on a laptop. That certainly wasn't the case in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So I think there's a difference there in terms of how we actually make great audio. And I think from that, that means that, radio has become much more relaxed in terms of you don't need a massive studio facility with double doors and soundproofing all over the place and everything else. And I think that's been a benefit to radio in many ways. I end up speaking a lot at radio conferences about what the future is. And it's always interesting talking with them and basically saying, look, we have still a very thriving radio industry. 9 out of 10 people listen to the radio in most countries in the world. So radio is doing very well. Now we're listening less and less than we used to, but nevertheless, radio is still a thing. However, when you start looking at the individual age groups, that's where the big change is. And younger audiences they're listening to far, far more speech than they always used to. That doesn't necessarily mean less music, but it certainly means far more speech. But what it also shows is that they are listening to on demand much more than they are live. And part of that might be that radio just isn't made for younger audiences. Radio is mostly made for people aged 55 or older, because those are the only people who are listening. But it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, I guess, that if you only make radio for old folk, then only old folk will listen. So you've got that kind of side of it as well. But I, kind of come back to this and say that at the end of the day, great audio is great audio. And if it's on a radio, great. If it's on a podcast, then fantastic. If it's on a streaming app, then fantastic too. These are all perfectly valid places to put great audio. And audio is a tremendously good way of telling stories, tremendously good way of telling stories from one human being to another in a way that we can't really do in any other platform. And so audio is a fantastic tool, however it gets to the audience. And I think from that point of view, if you make great audio, you will still be making great audio in 20 years' time. The way that people consume it might be a little bit different, but only a little bit.
James hits the nail on the head. No matter how much the tools and platforms change, great audio will always find its audience. From where I stand, it's not just about keeping up with the latest tech. It's about staying laser focused and delivering quality content that resonates. As much as we talk about innovation, the fundamentals of storytelling and audience connection are what keep you relevant in the long run. If you can nail that, the medium doesn't matter. You'll always have a place in this industry.
This is a podcast to a degree about people working in podcasting and trying to enter the field. Obviously, your fabulous newsletter has a jobs section.
It does.
From your kind of experience and your overview, where do you think the trends in the industry are in terms of professionalizing careers, bringing more people in and kind of raising that bar?
In quite a lot of industries, I think that specialism is a bit of a dying art. And I think that we all need to be a bit more capable of doing lots of different jobs, or at least understanding lots of different jobs. I spent some time at the BBC, and the BBC is a very compartmentalized organization where, you know, if you're a radio producer, then that's absolutely fine, but you're certainly not allowed to have any concept of any ideas on how to market a show, or, you know, because those are the marketing people and you go and talk to them, and those are the strategy people and you go and talk to them. If you work for small organizations, you're all of those things. And I think really when you're looking at people who are really succeeding in this world, yes, they are very good at what they do, but they also understand all of the other parts of the industry that they are in. And so I think that goes for any job in the world of podcasting, that yes, a great audio producer will make a great podcast, but you'll also know which bits to pull out to promote on social media. You'll also know how to add a video track if you want to make it look interesting and inviting on TikTok. You'll also know a bunch of other tremendous tools in there. And I think that that's probably, if you're really going to succeed, it's making sure that you are still a specialist in some things, but you still have a good overview of all of the other parts of the industry.
Yeah, we've actually been talking about that idea a lot in the last couple episodes, that like in podcasting, what's so unique about the industry is that you're really rewarded for kind of being a jack of all trades instead of just being like a master in one area. And thinking about it on the surface, it makes complete sense because podcasting really is a perfect combination of creativity and business.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think the other thing that I would probably say is if you are getting into podcasting, particularly if you're getting into podcasting for yourself, I think quite a lot of your success comes down to workflow, comes down to thinking about what you're doing and how you can produce a good quality product, good quality show with the least amount of effort. And I know that that sounds like a dreadful thing, but what I'm really saying is don't make life more complicated for yourself than you absolutely have to. So you might read lots of things about YouTube being a really popular place for a podcast. That may be the case for some shows. For most shows, it is not. So would you really start making a podcast with a full camera shoot, a full, 4 cameras in your studio, and there you are learning not just how to be a great interviewer and a great podcast host, but also learning how to talk to the camera, learning how all of that stuff works as well. That's just adding complication. By all means, add video on later if you want to. But if you're going to start off, then actually focusing on the workflow, focusing on making it as easy as possible for yourself is a really important thing. The format of your show, the length of your show, how your show works, whether or not your show has guests on every single week, however all of that stuff works, just make it as simple and as straightforward as you possibly can. Because the big thing that most podcasters do is that they pod fade, they stop podcasting. And the main reason is this is quite a lot of hard work, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And I'm not getting an awful lot back from it. And actually, if it's much less hard work, then you can afford to do it for much longer. And so make sure that everything you do is much less hard work. I automate an awful lot of the newsletter that you see, for example, because I know that I have to do the Podnews newsletter every single day. I know that I can't take a day off. And I know that one day I might have 45 minutes in an airport lounge, which I had last month, to do an entire day's newsletter. And I can fall back on the fact that a lot of it is automated. A lot of it is deliberately made to be relatively easy for me to put together, because that's how I built that entire, that entire tool. And so, yeah, it's just, keeping that in the back of your mind as well.
I really like this idea that James just shared. There's a key lesson here that's crucial for anyone looking to succeed in podcasting. It's all about workflow. Podcasting, like any creative endeavor, can be incredibly rewarding, but it's also a lot of work. Sustaining that work and ultimately your success depends on making your process as efficient as possible. Whether you're just starting out or you've been around for ages, it's easy to fall into the trap of trying to do everything at once, adding video, mastering new tech, and perfecting every tiny detail. But here's the reality. The simpler your workflow, the more likely you are to stick with it. This isn't about cutting corners, it's about being smart with your time and energy. In an industry where burnout is practically a rite of passage, those who find a sustainable rhythm are the ones who thrive. Podcasting is a marathon, not a sprint. The more streamlined and efficient your workflow, the more room you'll have for creativity and flexibility in the long run.
I would like to know what's next for you. If you've got time, that would be great to know.
Oh, what's next? What's next for me? I mean, I would like to continue doing the Podnews newsletter for probably the next 5 years, probably not much longer than that. I think what I find interesting in the industry is that there isn't an awful lot of organization in the industry. We've left it up to the IAB to do podcast measurement, which may or may not be the right thing. We don't really have a podcast advertising bureau. There's nobody out there who is independently shouting about the benefit of podcast advertising. We don't really have organizations getting together to talk about where the future might be going. And, is YouTube a good thing or a bad thing? Should we be fighting YouTube? Should we be fighting Spotify? None of that really goes on. And so I'm very keen in seeing if there's something there that I can help with. And I'm not saying that I should be doing it, because my goodness, no. But I do think there's something there in trying to get the industry to have a consistent view on things and trying to get those conversations started. So, if I could achieve anything in the next 5 years, perhaps that would be one of those things of getting the industry to work more consistently together. One of the benefits of podcasting is that we all love each other and we all want to see each other succeed. But let's make sure that we also are acting as one so that we can actually see what the future of the industry is going to be and make sure that that's the right kind of future for us.
Thanks for tuning into this episode. A big thank you to our panel, Daria Lawson, Sam Datapalan, and James Cridland for joining us today. I'm Adam Bender, and if you'd like to join us on People in Podcasting, just email sam@lowerstreet.co. That's just co. Let us know if you want to be a part of the show, or if you want to stay updated on the industry without stepping up to the mic, subscribe on your favorite app so you don't miss out. People in Podcasting is a Lower Street production. We're creating this to serve the industry and celebrate the people who make it what it is. We specialize in making podcasts for brands, and if you want to learn more about us or our services, get in touch. We'll see you next time.